Excited to welcome you to Office Hours, a program where we invite luminaries from the software world to share insights. These are one-on-one sessions with experts, and they've been a huge success. I'm Lauren Demuse, partner and COO at Theory Ventures, and I'm delighted to introduce our discussion. We've gathered questions from the audience. More than 600 people registered for the event today, and we'll chat in the fireside format for about 40 minutes, weaving in the questions you all submitted. And of course, please feel free to ask questions in the chat box on the YouTube channel page, and we'll see if we can intersperse them along the way. So let me introduce our speakers. Tom Tunguz is the general partner at Theory Ventures, our $230 million fund focused on companies leveraging technical discontinuities into go-to-market advantages. And prior to founding Theory, Tom spent 14 years at Redpoint as a general partner, where he made notable investments such as Looker, Expensify, Monte Carlo, and Customer. We're joined today by Raj Sarkar, a marketing leader with over 15 years of experience driving growth at some of the most well-known tech companies. Raj got a start at Cisco, building their marketing engine before moving to Google, where he helped launch Google Cloud. From there, Raj joined several leading SaaS companies, including Atlassian and Palo Alto Networks, where he pioneered viral and guerrilla marketing techniques to drive rapid user adoption. Raj coined the term Outbound Fury to describe his scrappy, unconventional approach to marketing that relied on creating controversies, thought leadership, and leveraging social media and organic challenges instead of paid advertising. Under Raj's leadership, products like Bitbucket, Trello, and others grew exponentially. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Tom.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Raj, thanks for joining. We really appreciate you coming on. And just to give you the audience some background, Raj and I were connected after I wrote a post about marketing teams as hedge funds and how marketing teams should have many different strategies. One of the hardest to execute is this outbound marketing strategy successfully. And Raj, you sent me to your blog post, which I loved. It's called Outbound Marketing Fury, and we'll put the link in the YouTube video. But we'd love to hear a bit about you. Like, you created this concept, you identified a bunch of different key moments for many of the companies that you worked for, and you called it Outbound Marketing Fury. What is Outbound Marketing Fury?
Yeah, first of all, Tom, thank you for inviting me here. I'm a huge fan of yours, blog post especially. I'm a subscriber and I've been reading them for quite some time. You love your post on startups and in general venture capital. So first of all, I'm happy to be here to talk about Outbound Fury. So Outbound Fury, I think the technical definition of Outbound Fury is being furious in your outbound motion. And use like different kind of tactics. And it can be like content, it can be video. I think the biggest difference is like being a little bit controversial, like out of the box, versus following the traditional method of doing outbound marketing. Let's put it that way. And I was fortunate enough to get introduced to this concept in my initial days at Google.
Sorry. So how was it that you came to be introduced to the concept at Google? Was it something that you came across? Was it something that someone inspired you? Did you see it within the ecosystem?
So we were just chatting before this, Tom. So I joined Google. Larry Page became the CEO. And Larry's attention was all on Facebook at that time. So Google Plus, I know some of you may remember this, was one of those huge projects which Larry was very closely involved with. I just joined the Google Enterprise team. And our team was obviously at that time were limited from a budget perspective. And Google Apps was basically going after one of the biggest behemoths like Microsoft Office, had a huge war chest. And the team was like, okay, how do we get attention, right, from customers? So one of the KPIs we came up with is every single article or every single blog post talking about Microsoft Office should talk about Google Apps. So that's how this whole concept actually started. And what used to happen is we used to meet on a weekly basis, like talking about what's going to happen from an outbound marketing perspective that week. So it was very tactical in nature, but hugely successful.
That's amazing. So so your first metric was share of voice. Every time Office is mentioned, we want to be there, and then so you could track that over time. And then the next, I guess it sounds like you met on a weekly basis. How did you? So that was your strategy. What were some of the tactics that you used to drive that awareness?
Yeah, I have one specific example which I always talk about, which was really funny on how we did it. For example, we came to know that, remember, Microsoft Office was on-prem initially.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm talking about 2011. And we came to know that because Google Apps was a cloud product, and we'll always say, hey, if you want to be in the cloud, if you want to be in the future, you should be on Google Apps. We came to know they were launching their cloud product, and they named it Office 365. So we got into a room and we were like, okay, what should we do interesting? Anything interesting we can do to get some attention around this? We somehow knew that, I think they publicly said they're going to launch the product on a particular date. And we basically wrote a blog post the day before the launch, and we called it 365 Reasons to Use Google Apps. Kind of poking at them because we knew they were going to name Office 365. Obviously, we didn't outline all the 365 reasons in the blog post. You can still go and read the post. I think Sean, I don't remember the PM who wrote the post, and we published it the day before the launch. Now, guess what happened the day after? When they actually first of all, press loves wars in general, like Microsoft Google war. And then every single press article which was talked about Office 365, they basically linked back to the Google post. So basically, we free eyeballs out of Office 365 launch. So that was one tactic which I've seen was like really successful for us.
That's a lot of fun. It reminds me a bit, I don't know if you've read the Benioff book. I think it's called From the Cloud or In the Cloud. And he also had this war, right, where Salesforce was fighting Oracle and Siebel. And Siebel had a conference in the south of France, and it was about an hour drive from the airport to the conference. And so Benioff called the taxi companies and bought every taxi and made the taxi rides free. There was a Salesforce account executive in each cab. And so here's a free ride, but before you get to the conference, you actually have to listen to the Salesforce.
Right. Yeah, I've heard that story actually.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so when you think about creating these content campaigns, there's judgment there, right? You're dancing a line here where you're kicking a hornet's nest, so to speak. You're taking a controversial position, and you're doing it in a way where you really want to create a positive outcome for everybody. And there are other examples within that blog post that you have. I remember, and it'd be amazing for you to share, but when somebody joins a company, right, where there's like a little bit of snark, or there's a little bit of just like a little bit of bite, but not too much. How do you determine who has the right taste to deliver that message? How do you get to that?
Good question, Tom. I think the first and foremost thing is this specific example works really well if you're a challenger, right? If you're number two, you tag on to number one because number one has more mind share than number two. This strategy might not work for every company, like every startup out there, right? But I think the way you can operationalize this, first of all, let's talk about the content stuff, which is a very important example. I'll give you specific examples of content which is very different from the example I gave you, right? So for example, during Bitbucket, Git was celebrating like 10 years. And we were like, okay, we need to do something interesting around this. So it has nothing to do with Bitbucket. We did a Git 10-year infographic, and we posted it on the blog post talking about the history of Git. Got a lot of attention on Hacker News, obviously, because it has nothing to do with Bitbucket. And then I think the Linux forum, they picked it up, right? So we got a lot of eyeballs around this content, which had nothing to do about Bitbucket. I think people usually try to do a lot of selling in their content, but if you do something interesting which just generate eyeballs for your product or your startup, that's all you need. I mean, you have to be very subtle around this. So this is one specific example of a content. A second specific example of a content which is like fun and humorous, right? For example, this is another example you'll see, I put it in the blog post. There's this guy called Zach Holman who was really influential during the GitHub days. Basically, he resigned and he posted that, hey, I resigned from GitHub because he was making fun of it. I'm joining Atlassian, something like that. And we were like, okay, what can we do interesting around this? Like, how can we generate some eyeballs? So basically what we did is, and this is like, obviously you can't do it, like as a marketeer, you can't do it yourself. It's basically with the help of the engineers. They basically created this mock desk, put some stash logos, Bitbucket logos, took a picture, and then we posted it on Bitbucket, put the Bitbucket Twitter account. So things like that. Now you can do like a lot of funny, humorous stuff, which you're going to get a lot of attention. Like Trello team, for example, if you see their blog, Trello's blog was incredibly popular.
Yes.
And they write, and the blog writes about stuff which has nothing to do about Trello. It has there's a lot of interesting articles around productivity and management and things like that. So I think the biggest thing you have to remember, you want to do something, like especially when you say Outbound Fury, you want to do something. It has to be nothing. You shouldn't be like overselling your product. That's whatever you do, basically keep that in mind.
That makes sense. So there's this great book called The Challenger Sale, which is about how if I'm a challenger, if I represent a challenger within an ecosystem, in order to convince a prospective customer to buy my product or even take my conversation, I need to frame the way that the prospect thinks about their core space. And what it sounds like to me, what you're saying, Raj, is the outbound marketing fury. It's a technique. It's a top of the funnel technique. It's not a bottom of the funnel technique. It's top of the funnel. And the idea is it's really about driving awareness, creating parity in a buyer's mind between two different products, one of which is established and one of which is the up and comer. And then building trust in a way where you can use humor or other means to just get people to remember you, get people to think, to establish a brand, a presence of the brand in a prospective buyer's mind.
Right, exactly.
Right? Got it. That makes sense. And then let's talk a little bit about when you're putting together an outbound marketing fury strategy, what does that team look like? You mentioned the tactics where you met on Mondays. Right. Who is we?
Yeah, so it's usually, the way to think about this is a cross-functional team, right? Mm-hmm. You need marketing, you need product, you need sales as well, right? And what you do is usually you put a monthly calendar already in place. And in that monthly calendar, you basically try to understand, okay, what's happening in the market. Mm-hmm. Git anniversary is a good example, right? Is there any like public holiday? Can you do something interesting around Christmas, right? So you basically lay out all the important stuff in that calendar. You also try to understand what if your competitor is trying to do something during the next 30 days or not, right? And then basically you start to figure out, okay, where the holes are. Like maybe 2 weeks, there's nothing happening. Like what interesting thing you can do in those 2 weeks, right? Okay. So this is like, then you start thinking about stuff which is going to be like creating content, like a good example is St. Patrick's Day, right? St. Patrick's Day, like Bitbucket, what can you do on St. Patrick's Day? So we did this interesting thing where, how people use Git, developers use Git, they basically check in their code. And when they checked in their code, this maple fog, green maple fog popped up. And everyone was like, what is this? And they started posting on Twitter, right? So you basically operationalize this entire process, mm-hmm. put it like a monthly calendar, and then figure out, okay, what's happening this month? Oh, this is the gap. How should we fill out this gap? And this is where some of creativity and out of box thinking sometimes.
Makes sense. So one question I've always had about a content calendar, and since we're on the subject, I'll ask you, but within a content calendar, are there different personas that you're targeting? So the reason I asked this question is when I was first starting to write the blog, I was asking a marketing expert about the right way to grow the audience. And this person said, who do you think the best content marketers are on the planet? And I said, I didn't know. And she replied, it's TV. So in the morning, right? And this was when TV was not on demand. This is when you had regular broadcast TV, but in the morning you had cartoons for the kids, right. And then you have the news, and then you have the soap operas, and then the news, and then there was a bunch of stuff. And so throughout the course of a day, you were hitting sort of different segments. And so she said, you should extrapolate this out to over the course of a month. Is that something that you think through with just broadly speaking and then with this strategy, or do you think you're targeting such a broad universal audience that maybe personas matter
I think
less?
you're putting an idea into my head right now. But we like, to be honest, when I was thinking about this, we were basically looking at PLG products and what is the core audience we are going after, and that's how we would think. We won't create, even if we create. Yes, there may be certain multiple personas we can talk. Like Trello is a good example, right? Trello is used by marketing teams. Trello is used by finance teams. Trello is used by engineering. So we'll think about that for sure. But I don't think like there was a conscious effort of thinking about like personas. The only person I would care about is user and buyer, because those are the two biggest personas you basically care about, but not at that granular level which you're talking about.
Yeah, I guess it makes sense, right? Because your goal is maximum awareness,
Right.
And so too much specificity for a particular campaign may not make sense with the Fury idea.
Exactly.
So you mentioned PLG. How do you think about this idea that marketing teams are a hedge fund? What we mean by that is, in order for a marketing team to have success, the portfolio of different strategies are important, and some strategies might work on a given day just because there's conferences or it's the doldrums of summer, and then some strategies might work in other. And so having a portfolio allows you to drive a certain level of predictability for awareness or leads or whatever the core metric is. How does the outbound marketing Fury strategy tie into, or how is it related to account-based marketing or outbound calling, inbound? How does it fit in?
Yeah, Tom, it's a great question, because I think that's the chapter 2 of Outbound Fury. Because I've already started thinking about this. I think it can be applied for ABM as well.
Okay.
Think about, but you need to know which specific, to your point, which specific like companies you're going after. You can do it at an individual company level, right? You can create Outbound Fury's team for individual. If you want to go after, for example, top 100 Fortune 100 companies, right? You can actually create an Outbound Fury for each of those Fortune 100 companies. I don't know if you heard this example, Tom. Brex, for example, wanted to attract a particular customer. They put a billboard specifically targeting that customer.
For a single customer.
Single customer at times. But it's a digital, it just displays, and they took a picture, they put it on social media. So they did that. This is a good example of creating Outbound Fury for a specific customer. So you can basically adopt that concept, like take the concept of our Outbound Fury, and you can basically work with your sales team and create a stream for each of the individual customer you want to go after.
That's interesting. Okay, so let's take that Brex example for a sec. How much do you think that billboard cost? Is it like order of 1,000, 5,000?
Digital. I don't know if it was constantly displaying it.
Okay, yeah.
But I know it was a digital. I think they were trying growth hacking. Again, this is all experimentation. It was digital. It just displayed. Someone took a picture, put it on Twitter, and then the company.
So relatively low cost, right? We're not talking about like a $20,000 to $50,000 campaign here for a single customer. This could be.
It may be even then, if your ACV is 200K, 4x return.
Right. And then if you sign a multi-year deal, you might be able to justify it, particularly if it's a named account or the top 200 accounts. And then the brand halo that exists after that story.
Exactly. It helps you as well. Yeah. I think that's a brilliant example of doing Outbound Fury for a specific customer. I think this is one of the areas like where I want to explore, like how do you extend Outbound Fury to account-based marketing as well?
It makes sense. It reminds me of Paul Graham's mantra, do things that don't scale, because that little act, maybe you can productionize it, but it'd be really difficult to productionize it. But the fact that it's this bespoke campaign to a particular customer, and then it received broad social media attention. In fact, like an unscalable thing actually did end up scaling really well. Maybe that's one of the key themes of this outbound marketing Fury effort, is you're doing things where they're unusual and they're custom or bespoke, and that creativity is what resonates within the social media ecosystem.
Yep.
Yeah, makes sense. So one thing that you mentioned that before, and I think just ties into your answer immediately here, is that there was a member of the sales team within your Monday org, and as we think about like account-based marketing and focus the outbound marketing Fury on an account basis, I'm curious, like one, why did you have that salesperson within that meeting? And two, like, do you think we talked about these messages as being very top of the funnel? Salesperson obviously is at the bottom of the funnel. Is there continuity in the messaging that goes up and down the stack, or at some point you kind of shift back to your classic product marketing message into the field support decks? And
Yeah. I think it's a good point. I think the reason, at least going back to the Google days, the reason sales team were there is because they have a lot of intel of what's going on in the market. And that kind of helped because they're much closer to the intel than we were. So that's one of the reasons why I think some of the sales people were involved. But again, going back to your question, like content for different phases of the funnel, like you can extend easily Outbound Fury different phases of the funnel as well, right? If you think about it, I'm talking about more broad awareness, because broad awareness is where it's the hardest thing to do as a startup. Once you bring a customer down the funnel, it becomes much easier to some extent. Now, that's why like the Outbound Fury concept is more applicable to top of funnel than it is for bottom of the funnel. But you can, like I was saying, ABM, like when you're creating an Outbound Fury for a particular customer, it has to be across the different phases of the funnel, right? The kind of content you're thinking about for top of funnel may not equate to what you're thinking about bottom of the funnel.
Yeah. So that makes sense. So you can tie, and I would characterize, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think about the outbound marketing fury as having a certain amount of irreverence to it, which again, like if you start with outbound marketing fury, you go down to challenge your sale, like the whole part of it is being irreverent, challenging the status quo, trying to convince the customer that they should rethink their mental model and framework for buying a particular kind of software.
Right.
And you've done that at security, you've done it for cloud products, you've done it at 1Password and others. So one of the questions is, how much, if any, resistance did you face from the exec team? Did you face any sort of concern that I might not be comfortable with this particular campaign, or we really are kicking a hornet's nest and we might get stung?
Yeah, you nailed it. There is a lot of hesitation in general.
There is. Okay.
There is always a lot of hesitation in general, because I don't think people are comfortable going outside, because there is some risk associated with it.
There is, right?
Like, imagine that 365 reasons to do. There was some risk associated. Like there is always a possibility that it might backfire. Have to be a little bit careful. The point is, you will try out 10 ideas, like 8 of them will not work, 2 of them will work and stick. There is always, you have to your point, there is a thin line, like where you're crossing that line. I mean, outbound, like the 365 reason to consider apps may not be the right strategy for every startup out there. Right. Let's put it that way. There is always the possibility of a backlash. So you have to be, I think the Atlassian examples are more like, it's controversial. I remember when we were talking about putting the green maple leaf, for example, the first time, there were people who were like, on the engineering side, hey, that's going to break my coding flow. It's like, why are we doing this? So there was some resistance to it, but we were like, why don't we try it once? So what we did is we tried with a small sample size first.
Makes sense. Okay.
And there is always these things. Think about it. Brax basically doing it like another good example, like doing it for one particular customer. I mean, you can say the customer might, this is too cheap or cheeky or something like that. But if you are like, that's the only way you're going to stand out in today's world, is taking a risk and doing something interesting. Everyone else is doing like boring stuff. Like, yeah, you can keep doing boring stuff, but that means you're not going to get any attention. That's the whole point of Outbound Fury.
That makes sense. And you mentioned there, you expect 80% of these campaigns to fail. Is that right? 20% to succeed.
Yeah. It's like Bezos wrote about this. In baseball, there is a limitation on how much you can make. Like, it's a home run. But in tech, you can get unlimited returns if it is successful.
Yeah, that's right. Got it. And so when you're with your teams, you're framing, okay, on Mondays, we expect 80% of campaigns to fail. We'll try this week, see what happens. Yeah. And then if a message resonates, do you continue with that message for some period of time?
I think, yeah. So the maple leaf example is a good example. So for example, we did the pride thing after that. So we did it like 2 or 3 times, basically tried to like replicate that idea.
Yeah.
But like the whole thing around the Outbound Fury is like you're doing something surprising and different, right? If you just keep copying what you're doing, then it's no more interesting in any shape or form, right? So it has to be like a constant iteration of ideas. Like again, it's not always like a home run or zero. Like it might be just like you get a one. Like it can be just like you get 25% there or 50% there.
Makes sense. Awesome. Okay, and then measurement. We talked a bit about
Yeah.
measurement, which was share of voice. So it clearly must be a big component, right? Especially you're the challenger, you're the
Yeah.
pretender trying to come up and dethrone the king, so to
Yeah.
speak. What other metrics are important as you think about the outbound marketing fury that would be different from a classic product marketing or
Yeah,
SEM?
I think to your point, you nailed a very fundamental question that how do you measure success? And measuring success for an outbound fury, like these specific examples I'm giving you, is very hard. The only way you can measure it is by looking at impressions from a particular thing you're doing, or if you can put it's a link, you put a campaign flag, and you basically track like how many clicks you're getting, or like those kind of things. I think the whole idea of outbound fury is additive over time.
Mm-hmm.
It's
You're building a brand, and so
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
compounding interest, one
Yeah,
layer, one layer, one
exactly.
layer, the
Exactly.
repetition. Yeah.
So the way to look at whether you're making progress is trends.google.com. As simple as that. Like how is your search traffic, especially on your product name, is going over time. That's a very good way of saying, hey, is your strategy actually working or not over time? And that's the only thing I think about, like for a startup, right? For a big company, you can easily hire like an agency called like Blue Ocean and things like that, who are going to go and measure your share of voice in the market. But for a company which is just getting started, the best way to look at it is basically trends.google.com. And you should have to keep trying, and you'll see like over time it's having an impact from an awareness perspective.
Makes sense. Great. We've got a question here from a viewer, which I think touches on the previous topic, which is how do you ensure that the Fury strategy strikes the right balance between attention and maintaining brand integrity? And let me add on to this question. Does the brand itself need to have a certain level of irreverence in order for this strategy, like this like up and comer, chip on the shoulder, a little rougher around the edges, maybe? Do you need that to exist before you
Yeah, it's good point, because if you're building a brand from the ground up, it's much easier to do this, right? If
Mhm.
you have an already existing brand and you're trying to do outbound fury, then it becomes harder, right?
Right.
Because
Yeah.
so when you basically start off as like the first marketeer in a company, the first thing, like when you're thinking about outbound fury, you need to think about, okay, what kind of like brand attributes you're trying to portray as a particular product or as a particular company. It starts from there, basically, to be honest. Hey, these are like, we want to be fun, we want to be delightful, we want to have a conversation with our customer, we want to be approachable, right? So
Yes.
these kind of attributes you basically think about. And then the other thing you think about is like, well, from a thought leadership perspective, what do we want to achieve, right? So it can be as simple as, hey, when everyone is talking about Bitbucket should be mentioned, right? Or we want to be perceived as the Git solution for professional teams. Like, how do we establish that? So you have to think about also, there is some meaning behind doing an outbound fury. You're not just doing outbound fury for the sake of doing outbound fury.
Right. So you should really be thinking about what is the long-term brand you want to establish, and
Exactly.
then drive the Fury strategy to that brand to be able, okay, that makes sense. And what you said that resonated with me there is you don't have to be I think of like Virgin as an irreverent brand, or I'm struggling for an example here, but like a contentious brand, somebody who's deliberately picking a fight. You don't need that within the core DNA of the company. This can just be a company that just has a different voice, different view, a different personality, a different ethos within the market. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Another question from a viewer is, can you execute this strategy when there's an order of magnitude difference in pricing? So let's say you're the low cost entrant. I'm not sure if Office 365 versus Google Suite was that, or Bitbucket versus GitHub. In my mind, the pricing of those two collections of products is relatively similar, but do you think it works where you're representing the low cost entrant?
Messaging around price or value is always dangerous.
Oh, okay. Explain.
I think you may be perceived as the whole problem of Apple and versus Android.
Yeah, that's right.
There is this from as a brand marketer perspective, that is the challenge around like how do you position yourself as, I think, in your, at least your overall, I think it's price is more a conversation when you go down the funnel. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a conversation for this. So you wouldn't, at the top of the funnel, you
I
should
wouldn't.
never be messaging price. We are the low cost.
I won't do that. Yeah, it can
And is
tarnish
that
your brand. It can tarnish your brand as well.
it
That's the
would it will erode the brand, and it ultimately limits your options because if you're known as the low cost, it's very difficult to move up market. You can look at this with
exactly
car companies, right? Tesla
exactly.
started at the premium part of the market and has moved down. It's much more difficult for, say, Volkswagen to move up.
And especially for B2B, like
Mhm.
I think brand maybe consumer brand maybe like Southwest, for example, they are
Mhm.
known as a low cost carrier. But can you like I'm thinking about in my like back of my head, do I know a B2B brand which positions themselves as a low cost? I cannot think of one actually.
So the closest thing would be open source. There's a closed source
Yeah.
company, and then there's an open source which is free at the developer tier, right? That might be the one place where you could say there is this, and a bunch of people might use an open source analytics tool as opposed to paying Mixpanel or GitHub or Amplitude, not GitHub, Amplitude. And so there's a cost advantage, but you're right, like they're positioned more as being open source, and the value proposition there is it's open as opposed to, hey, it's free.
No.
Um,
GitHub never positioned themselves as
yeah, but GitHub feels like a premium brand. It
yeah, it feels
feels
like a
the
premium band,
developer.
right? Yeah, exactly.
That's interesting. Okay. Can you, a third question from the viewers, and please, if you have other questions, add them in here. How do you think about the outbound marketing fury and the analyst community, like the Gartners and the Forresters? Do those messages ever, do
Yeah.
they ever intersect, or is it, are you wearing a t-shirt in order to conduct the outbound marketing fury and you're putting on
Yeah.
your suit to talk to the Gartner analyst?
Great question. Remember again, when there is a difference between user and buyer, like the
Hmm.
messaging you have for the user and the messaging you have for the buyer, it's not going to be the same.
Okay.
The Gartner stuff is mostly for the buyers. So your messaging is primarily targeted towards buyers who are going to buy your solution. Now, as a startup, like I think a bigger question, like how do you get attention from Gartner? Because Gartner usually doesn't want to talk to startups in general. So one of the few things, because I talk to like founders about this, one is how can you get your customers, if you have enterprise customers, to go and give Gartner peer reviews. I don't know if you've heard, like Gartner peer reviews is basically very well established. So that can be one way of getting attention from Gartner. The second way to get attention from Gartner is usually if you have an enterprise customer,
Hmm.
they have a relationship with Gartner.
Oh, I see.
Ask them to give introduction and talk about you to their Gartner analyst, and then basically you start getting like attention from them as well. So
The
that is,
whisper network. Yeah.
yes, exactly. So that's would be you can get, but messaging is for Gartner versus outbound fury. Going after user versus going after buyer. You may have to think about, is it the same or a different messaging? Now, I'm not saying you can't do outbound fury for buyer. You can do that, but it more works very well for user in
For the
general.
user. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, great. And another question from the audience, like, what is the appropriate stage for outbound? Can you execute this as a 10-person startup? Or do you need to be 50 people or 150 people? Do you need a certain budget? Do you need a certain team composition?
No, I think this is the cool thing about outbound fury. You can even like you. What do you need? You need a website. You need a social media account, and you need a product. Those are the three things you need in order to do it. Even a one person startup can do it. You see this all. What is a good example? I'll give you a one-person startup. Show HN or Hacker News. That's a one-person startup doing outbound fury right there, right? You don't need like an army of people in order to do outbound fury. Even the founders themselves, they can do it. That already on LinkedIn. If you go to LinkedIn nowadays, there is so many founders who have become influencers.
That's
So
right. Yeah, that's right. And it's the founder that's actually driving million
right,
from farthest space, right? You can think about him. who is just very, just, yeah, he's out there, right? He's present in the ecosystem and he's willing to take very aggressive positions. And that's part of the brand. Another sort of related idea, and I'm curious if you agree or disagree, but one marketer once told me the goal of marketing is to amplify the brand values that the founder or the C-suite is setting rather than create them out of the gate. And so it seems to me like if you have one of these founders, Aaron Levy was another one, right? Or Nick from Gainsight, right, where they get up and they would stand on stage with different shoes, and Nick always had a lot of fun with the music videos, and it just he had a personality that came out, right, and it's different than Steve Ballmer yelling on stage and dancing.
Tom, you bring up a very good point about brand and the connection with values of the company, because your brand attributes and your value, like company values, they need to match. If they don't match, then you're not going to be successful. So to your point, you're absolutely right. I think the founders, a very good example is like, there are so many like out there people like Elon Musk, for example, influences the brand of a company like crazy, is a very good example. So there are a lot of founders, like they indirectly they kind of influence the brand here and there. And you gave some very good examples actually as well.
Makes sense. Awesome. I learned a lot today, Raj. I learned a lot about Marketing Fury. You have incredible experience. This is a technique that's really useful for top of the funnel education when you are an up and comer and you're focused more on the user than you are on the buyer. It's all about expanding reach and connecting that to challenger sales motion. And the last part of it is, even if you have less of an irreverent brand, even if you're more conservative brand, you can still execute the strategy in a way where you can assert yourself in market. And actually, I'll add one more point, which is one of the most important metrics when you're evaluating the success of this strategy is about share of voice. It's about how can I get out into the ecosystem and create those 7 or 8 brand impressions so that when somebody thinks about a particular piece of software, a particular category, you're in the conversation just as much as the incumbent.
Nailed it, Tom.
Raj, thank you 1,000 times. This was a lot of fun to have this conversation and to talk to somebody who's had so much experience in many different domains applying this technique.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thanks for the invitation, Tom and Lauren.